And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Monday, February 10th, 2025. And starting with the sea ice, we've had very brisk east-southeast winds coming in across the southwest mainland and along the coast. We have a high wind warning for this area of the lower Yukon Valley, including the Yukon Delta. Winds could gust as high as 50-60 miles an hour, and there will be some other strong winds off the various capes and points down here from Kuskokwim down through Bristol Bay. Nevertheless, ice movement will be westward at least through tonight into early on Tuesday. And with warmer temperatures, we've seen readings in the 40s along areas of Bristol Bay and up here through the northern part of the Alaska Peninsula, so that is facilitating some melting there. As far as what we got coming up, very strong high pressure out over the lower Yukon Northwest Territories here in northwest Canada. This feature is going to more or less hold through the week, kind of morphing. It'll weaken and then re-strengthen, and as it does so, it's just going to kind of be anchored over this broader area of northwest Canada. This current deeper low that's crossed the far western Aleutians is pulling back toward the Asia coastline, and it has an occluded front ahead of it. This front is what's causing those gustier winds along the YK deltas as we go through tonight and into mid-morning on Tuesday. There is a high wind warning for this area, again, of the lower Yukon through 9 a.m. on Tuesday. So by the time we get into Tuesday afternoon and evening, this low feature will wash out and the front tend toward weakening. And then by the time we get into Wednesday, not a whole lot left of that. And the main low back out here down to 982 millibars with a trough, with a kind of secondary trough pushing slowly eastward. Across the mainland, the high pressure has temporarily weakened in this region, but there's a 1050 plus high up here out over the Arctic Ocean that's going to build a ridge back down here into this region around Great Slave Lake area. And that's going to push some colder air and stronger winds along the Beaufort Sea coast and into the east central interior up through the Yukon Flats. We're going to see some stronger gusty winds create blowing, drifting snow, colder wind chills. Could have blizzard conditions along areas of the Beaufort Sea coast here Wednesday into Friday as a result of that. So for the southeast, the Panhandle areas, the inner channels on Tuesday, winds northwest 10-15 knots, waves generally 2-3 feet, especially there through Stevens Passage and up through Lynn Canal. Offshore flow lighter than it has been a week ago, so we're looking at offshore flow for the Gulf Coast around 10 knots and swells 7 to 8 feet. For Wednesday, winds a little stronger up through Lynn Canal, northerly 20 knots, northeast 20 knots, Stevens Passage, waves running a few feet. North winds 15 knots there, Dixon entrance with a few foot waves. And generally speaking, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots here along the coast within 10 nautical miles of shore with swells right around 8 to 9 feet. Winds will be rather brisk on Tuesday. Entrance of Cook Inlet, 45 knot easterly gales, waves 13 to 15 feet. As we go up along the Kenai coast, east winds of 30 knots, northeast winds of 30 knots, middle Cook Inlet off of Anchor Point. And then for the area within Prince William Sound, east winds to 10 knots. On Wednesday, those winds will come down considerably, variable winds around 10 knots within Prince William Sound. Generally, across a broad area of the region, across the Kenai Peninsula down through Cook Inlet, northeast winds 10 knots, upper Cook Inlet to maybe 20 knots down here through lower Cook Inlet, and as much as 25 knots there just northeast of Kodiak Island with the waves in that area can maybe as high as 10, 11 feet. For Tuesday around Kodiak Island, easterly gales 35 to 40 knots. Winds could be, waves could be as high as 19 feet as you get offshore there of Kodiak Island, 9 feet Shelikof Strait, and then easterly gales of 35 knots within Bristol Bay, but then you have these southeast winds 15 to 20 knots through the lower half of the Alaska Peninsula. Highest waves 13 to 15 feet on the North Pacific side. And then for Wednesday, winds around Kodiak Island will be northeasterly around 30 knots. And then as they go down the length of the Alaska Peninsula, northeast winds kind of turning more easterly, and then variable only around 10 knots around either side there at Cold Bay and False Pass. Across the Aleutians, that deep low continues to pull further westward, so the full brunt of that letting up. But generally, southeast to south winds around 25 knots through the eastern half of the Aleutians. The western half west of Adak, look for south-southwest winds 30 to 35 knot gales, strongest Kiska to Shimia. And then for Wednesday, relatively lighter winds, especially here through the central eastern Aleutians. We're looking at generally southeast-south winds around 15 knots. And as we get west of Adak, south-southwest winds around 25 knots. And for areas of the southwest coast, we have that frontal system coming up like this, not moving much. Going to have some stronger winds along that. We're looking at east-southeast gales of 40 knots, Bristol Bay, Kuskokwim Bay. And then along the Yukon Delta coastline, east-southeast winds of 30-35 knots and easterly winds of 30 knots there out of Norton Sound. The ice in place, again, some of that ice could drift a bit westward, especially north of St. Matthew Island. And then on Wednesday, we're going to look at generally offshore flow across the mainland. Northeast winds 20 knots out of Bristol Bay, east winds there within Kuskokwim Bay at 20 knots, and then northeast winds around 15 knots from Norton Sound down along the lower Yukon Delta. And then for areas of the Pribilofs up to St. Matthew, southeast winds around 20 to 25 knots. And then going up through the Bering Strait, strongest winds coming off the Seward, west side of the Seward Peninsula up to 35 knot gales. The lower Chukchi Sea, generally easterly offshore flow to 25 knots. And then as we get up from Point Lay to Utqiagvik, look at northeast winds 10 to 15 knots. Those winds turn westerly 10 to 15 knots, Prudhoe Bay on over to Kaktovik. But notice the reversal of the winds starting on Wednesday with that big high up in the Arctic Ocean and a little backdoor cold front coming through, and then the high building another ridge out toward Great Slave Lake. That area, that's going to enhance the winds. So winds are going to start to pick up on Wednesday into Thursday. 30 knot easterly winds, Kaktovik, Prudhoe Bay, cause some blowing snow, and that could increase, especially Wednesday night into Thursday. And then dropping down along the lower portion of the Chukchi Sea coast, we're looking at northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, and then through the Bering Strait, generally westerly winds off the Seward Peninsula, or easterly flow off the west side of the Seward Peninsula. And there on the north side of St. Lawrence Island, we're looking for easterly winds at 15 knots, and again, plenty of ice in place along this region of the far north.